Hello, welcome to Module 1. In this module, we're going to talk about some of the history behind American forests. So in the previous video, you would have watched a summary of what we're going to talk about in Module 1. And so we're going to take those concepts and dig a little deeper and talk about them in a little bit more detailed way. I already said that. Anyway, so that's what we're going to do. Just a reminder that throughout this video, I'm going to give you little questions to answer in your online lecture notes. So should have a link to a lecture note in your Canvas. And so please link to that and make notes on what we're talking about in this class. So in the video, we mentioned that the Americas were covered by about 1 billion acres of forest. That is a lot of forest. And if you've never been back east, the scope of that just probably is not understandable in your mind. But I grew up back east. I grew up in Ohio. And where I grew up, there were trees everywhere. And even though we had agriculture fields everywhere, corn and soybean fields everywhere, if one of those fields became abandoned or something, within a few years, that field would be covered in trees. And it was amazing. And so most of my childhood, I spent a lot of time out in under trees and running around underneath trees, and it was just part of your existence. And so understanding the potential for those trees back east is just part of an experience if you live outside of a city. So before European settlement, 1 billion acres covered most of the eastern United States. 3/4 of these forests were in the east. There are some forests in the west, mostly up in the mountains. Today, we're at about 751 million acres that remain, so 70%. We've lost about 30%. But when I show you, I think in the video, I showed you of original forest that is still there, and that's a lot of lost forest that is no longer available to us. So let's talk about a landscape for a minute. When we talk about landscapes and this landscape ecology, we're talking about a large ecosystem, an ecosystem that encompasses many kind of micro ecosystems. You know, you've got the forest floor, and then you've got the canopy, and above the canopy, and all of those all play a role in the wider landscape that is forests. What we call a forest biome. So forests stretch almost interrupted from the east coast, almost, depending where you're at, along the Mississippi River, and maybe a little bit beyond that in places, before you get into the Great Plains grasslands. And so lots and lots of forests. New England, Pennsylvania, New York, down into Maryland, into Ohio, is all of this deciduous forest. And when I say a deciduous forest, I'm talking about trees with broad leaves on them, so not pine trees, okay? And if you ever want to see something absolutely amazing, go into that part of the country in the fall. The beautiful fall colors are just absolutely amazing, and they are fabulous. And so, yeah, New England, almost pretty much the Mississippi River, lots of different types of ecosystems because there's different types of trees. Hardwoods, there are some pine forests, especially as you go south into the southern states. And of course, way up north, we've got boreal forests that are pretty neat as well. Out west here where I'm at now, we have lots of what we call ponderosa pine forest, aspen forests, and so they're usually a bit drier of a forest. They're not as wet, but they're massive and they're beautiful nonetheless. We also have woodland forests. The first time I drove into northern Arizona, and I saw they had a national forest of juniper trees, and juniper trees are not super tall, and I thought this is a forest. But now that I've been here for half my life, now that I recognize it as a forest. So, but yeah, they don't have to be super tall trees in order to be called a forest. Um, Along the west coast, there are also some pretty crazy forests. We've got our redwood forests in the west, and they are tall, massive trees that are amazing as well. All right. Now, in these forests, there's quite a bit of biodiversity, meaning there's lots of different types of wildlife, plant life as well. But in this slide, I want to mention the wildlife. Uh, Prior to European settlement, the Native American cultures used a lot of these as food sources. They lived as part of their ecosystem, and they followed the bison herds around for their food sources. And the bison herds were massive, and they covered the Great Plains and into the west. Elk herds are still fairly large in different places in the United States. If you're up near Flagstaff, at the right time of the year, you could find huge herds of elk, and they are just magnificent creatures. There are elk herds even as far down as where I'm at here in southeastern Arizona. Moose up north, and countless bird species. So the passenger pigeon was this bird that is now extinct. I think the last bird died in the 1960s. But it was a huge group of birds that lived as a unit. Hundreds of thousands and millions of these birds lived as a unit, and they were up in the sky. And unfortunately, it became kind of a sport to start shooting the birds out of the sky when they would mass together, and their populations got down to a point where they could no longer sustain themselves, and unfortunately they've gone extinct. But they used to darken our skies in the Americas, and no longer do that. Forests are what we call critical habitats for lots of that wildlife. A lot of this wildlife use forest as kind of a way to hide from predators and other animals that could hurt them, and so they don't do well outside of that habitat. They don't reproduce, and so it is absolutely essential that forests are maintained in order to allow for these animals to survive, both birds and deer, elk, and moose. Bison are being reintroduced slowly in different parts of North America, but for the large part, they are not free to roam as they once were, and were hunted to near extinction. So this brings us to the Native American influence on the ecosystem prior to European settlement. They, interestingly enough, had their own land management practices that they had developed over the hundreds of years prior to European settlement that they were here, and so they helped shape the landscapes that we have today, and prior to European settlement. For example, they did practice agriculture to some extent. Controlled burns were also used in order to manage forests, which is incredibly important because a lot of our forests are what we call fire-adapted ecosystems. They need fire. And so for the last 100 years, we've been managing wildfire by putting fires out. And now what we do have is a whole bunch of forests that have way too much wood, what we call fuel, on the ground. And so when fire comes, it just burns like a firecracker. And we've got huge catastrophic wildfires, especially here in the West. Fire was used for hunting, travel, pest control, which is really important as well. There's a lot of good use of pest control to get rid of infected trees and stuff like that. We don't want the trees to get infected with things like bark beetle and other stuff. And of course, if you burn, you also open up areas for foraging animals as well. So as such, anywhere from the deserts ecosystems up into the deciduous forests, these ecosystems are what we call dynamic, meaning that they change a lot. They're also another term we use is resilient, is that typically they bounce back really good from disturbance. Now there are some ecosystems like the arid desert where I'm at right now that aren't fire adapted. They're not designed to have lots of disturbance in like wildfire. There are those places as well, but generally speaking, when we have forest ecosystems, they are able to adjust and adapt and come back after crazy things like weather and fire and even people. And that makes them very dynamic in their ability to adjust to certain situations and resilient. Okay. Now we often like to think of forest as prior to European settlement as quote untouched, and I think that what we have found from Native American cultures is that simply isn't the case. It's been touched by human hands for a long time, and that's okay. We are part of the ecosystem as well as the other animals are. And I think what that means, though, is that we need to be very good stewards of the land, as part of the example that was given to us as from the indigenous peoples that were here before us, before the European settlers. And so just a good lessons for us to understand. There's no such thing as an untouched wilderness in this world that we live in today. And so early European impressions were that explorers and settlers were awed by the vast forests and game. Yep, there's lots here, lots of resources, and they thought that it was endless. Of course, we learned that that's not the case. Forests were seen as both a resource and an obstacle to farming. So a lot of early settlers said, hey, we got to get rid of these trees so that we can have farmland. And since the East is pretty much where everything started, they really worked on clearing those out. Timber and fuel wood became a vital export, especially white pine and oak. And so we'll talk more about those later. Forest use in colonial times, settlers cleared the forests for crops, fencing, and fuel. They needed to create tools, and that required making iron tools. That required heat, so they used that to make their stoves in order to do that. And of course, farming, fencing, charcoal production was also very important, and they made that out of the wood as well. But all of that led to deforestation, and when you've got animals that rely on that habitat and we're using those animals for a food source, then we get a reduction in those food sources. So deer, turkey, beaver, bison were all affected by the reduction in habitat and hunting. And we came up with this term that occurs when nobody really is responsible for the land, but everyone goes out and tries to use it. And that's this term called tragedy of the commons. So if the land belongs to everybody and nobody's responsible for it, then it's a common land, and no one really feels like that they need to um, be responsible, use the land responsible. And so that's this idea of tragedy of the commons. And that there is no better example of that as we moved west, we brought lots of goats up into the mountain, sheep, lambs, whatever, and cattle, and we just put all of these grazing livestock out on the land, and there wasn't enough grass on the land like there is back east to handle the weight of that pressure from the and so then we saw tragedy of the commons. All the grass got ate out. The valley that I'm in right now used to be a grassland, and now it's all shrubs because all the grass got ate out. And so it's not very good for livestock anymore. And so that's tragedy of the commons. And as a result, we got our first regulatory laws and legislation started to come about in the 20th century, which we'll talk about later. So next up, in this module, you're going to learn your vocabulary from some of the things that we've talked about thus far. In the text there, so some of this is coming from the text. You'll learn some vocabulary and some meanings of those words. And then you're also going to do a lab. And in these labs, we're going to learn about different tree species and ecosystems moving from eastern United States to the western United States. Okay, and so you're going to learn your first 5 trees. Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful experience, and I'll talk to you later.